Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In letters 5 and 6 in the correspondence between Heloise and Abelard, we see them coming to a kind of resolution, one that is hopeful but is, you could say, at its early stages. So there's still a struggle against passion going on, and we're going to see that Heloise will give Abelard what could be some good news, although admit towards the end, I'm not entirely there. And Abelard is going to suggest that they should both be turning their attention to God, that this should be their last exchange of letters, and he's going to provide some spiritual guidance, which is what Heloise has already asked him for in the past. So she is ill, and because of that illness, she's, reevaluating things. Prior to this in the letters, she's saying, we really, as husband and wife, even though we're in religious communities, we've taken vows, we're still married, and we could enjoy some sort of married happiness together. I only took the vows because I wanted to please you. And, I didn't do it for God, but you've kind of trapped me in this tomb of being the abbess of a nunnery, of a convent, right? And Abelard, for his part, is saying, I didn't take my vows really for the right reason either. And I didn't ask you to take vows for the right reason. I was jealous. I didn't want you to leave me behind and fall in love with somebody else. So they've got a lot to work through. And Heloise, now after having experienced this illness, she says, I have changed my views on these matters. She says, I'm going to discover to you my falseness, though instead of reproaching me, I persuade myself you will shed tears of joy. Why? Well, when I have told you what rival ravished my heart from you, my husband, you will praise my inconstancy and will pray this rival to fix it. Who is that rival? Well, God. God is the person that she is supposed to be oriented towards. We'll see that there's a metaphor of being married to God coming up in this. And she goes on and says that, I imagine that you're impatient to know what means God used to change my mind, to accomplish so great an end. So she says, I fell dangerously ill. The physicians gave me over. I expected certain death. Having that experience put things into perspective. Then my passion, which had always before seemed innocent, what passion? Love for Abelard, now seems criminal. My memory represented faithfully to me all the past actions of my life, and my love was the only pain that I felt. And she said, I began to dread the wrath of God. Now I was going to experience it, and I repented I'd made no better use of his grace. Now, this is a term that's going to come up several times in these letters. Grace is God giving help of some sort to human beings and working through them to make them better if they use that grace. So she talks about having remorse of mind or repentance. She's unhappy about her past actions and even present condition. So she says, this changed things for me. Solitude is insupportable to a mind which is not easy. Since I've been shut up in these walls of the convent, I have done nothing but wept for our misfortunes. I've worn out my days in grief and sighing. Instead of fulfilling God's merciful design on me, I have offended him. I've looked on this refuge as a prison. I've borne with unwillingness the yoke of the Lord. Instead of sanctifying myself by a life of penitence, I've confirmed my reprobation. So I was not doing what I should be doing. And she goes on and says, you are no more that amorous Abelard who, to gain a private conversation with me by night, used to contrive new ways to deceive the vigilance of our observers. The misfortune which happened to you, castration, gave you a horror for vice, and you instantly consecrated the rest of your days to virtue and seemed to submit to this necessity willingly. Me, not so much. Now, of course, she knows from previous letters that Abelard did not submit himself in any such way, but she's, she's presenting him as if he's a better person, and she's saying, I need to live up to this too. We both now need to be able to commit to God. And then she admits something. She says, some secret trouble rises in my soul. What unthought of motion opposes the resolution I formed of sighing no more for Abelard? And she goes on and says, I'm not entirely there. Grace overtook me. I promised to be faithful to it, but now I find myself perjuring myself and sacrificing even grace to Abelard. I'm not doing what I should be doing. And then she says, well, maybe I'm being unreasonably afraid. Virtue directs all my emotions. They're subject to grace. She says, fear no more, Abelard. I have no longer those sentiments which, being described in my letters, caused you so much trouble. And then she goes on to say, and this kind of echoes what he said in a previous letter, I free you from all of your oaths. Forget the name of lover and husband, but keep always that of father, spiritual advisor in this case, right? So the question then is, can she live in virtue and use grace? And she's saying, yeah, I think that's actually possible. She says she's rereading the letters, not the letters of love that she was kissing before, but the letters in which you described to me the advantages of virtue. So she says, you cannot be silent without a crime. I was having trouble. It would have been made sense for you not to write to me when I was so subject to this passion, but now I need advice from you. And not as a husband, but as a spiritual director. It was okay for you to deny me in my misery a comfort which was left me because you thought it was pernicious, bad for me. But now you should indeed write to me. And she says, virtue actually makes things so much better. There's no pleasure upon earth but that which virtue gives. She talks about grace opening her eyes. Solitude looks charming. The tranquility which I behold here enters my very heart. In the satisfaction of doing my duty, I feel a pleasure above all that riches, pomp, or sensuality could afford. And she says, I've torn you from my heart. And be not jealous. God reigns there in your stead. That's exactly what you wanted for me, Abelard, isn't it? God in place of you. And so she says, you still have a place in my mind, which you'll never lose. And I take a secret pleasure in thinking of you, and I esteem it a glory to obey the rules you will give me. So keep writing me. I will read your letters. She also deals with the issue very quickly of nuns perhaps not doing the right thing. She says, well, you need to write us. You need to counsel us, right? And then she goes on and says, you've been complaining about your own unhappiness. Here's what you need to do. Let me see no more in your letters, Abelard, murmurs against fortune. You are not the only one she's persecuted. And she goes on and says, you're a philosopher. Govern yourself by example. I was born with violent passions. I am trying to struggle with them myself. You can do this as well. And then she says something really quite interesting. My dear husband, this is the last time I will use that expression. Shall I never see you again? So the question is, would it be good for her to see Abelard or not? And she's very conscious of the fact that because she's not already there in Christian perfection, that could be a problem. She says, if the memory of Abelard caused me so much trouble, what would his presence do? Wouldn't it reignite those desires in my soul and make it difficult for me to follow reason, virtue, duty? So she goes on and she says, pardon me, Abelard, pardon a mistaken lover. There's no more time to require from you a perfect correspondence of desires. We have bound ourselves to austerities, that is, giving things up, right? A rough life. Let us think of our duties in these rigors and make a good use of that necessity, which keeps us separate. We have to stay apart. So let's keep doing what we're doing. Let's keep on the path. She ends the letter, however, by admitting something. She says, I begin to perceive I take too much pleasure in writing to you. I ought to burn my letter. It shows I'm still engaged in a deep passion for you. So she's ending it by saying, I know what I need to do. I'm actually making a lot of progress, but I've got some struggles to deal with. So Abelard is going to begin his letter, letter 6, by saying, don't write to me anymore. It's time to end this commerce, which makes our mortifications, our giving things up, no advantage to us. We've retired from the world. We're in a monastery and a convent. Let's act like, religious people. Let's no more deceive ourselves that we can, you might say, have it all, or have both a religious life and have whatever's left of our love. So he says, let's actually commit to religious perfection. Let's try to carry it to a very difficult point. And he says, we can never raise ourselves to too great heights when God is the object. We're never going to reach the absolute peak, but let's shoot for that. Let's act for God's glory without any regard to our own desires or sentiments of others. And he says, if we were going to actually live like this, I could come and live in your convent, the Paraclete, which I established and then gave to you and your nuns. That's not really the case, though. We're not as far along as we should be. And he says, your heart still burns with that fatal fire, which you cannot extinguish. And mine is full of trouble and uneasiness. So we're not ready for that. Abelard says that he no longer has to fear fortune, chance, the things that are going to happen, or even his enemies. His enemies are terrible people. They still exist. The only thing he really has to worry about is Heloise's fatal passion, he says. You're enslaved, your letters declare to me, to a fatal passion. If you cannot conquer it, you cannot be saved. And what do you want me to do in this case? I'm not going to encourage it. I'm going to try to suggest to you we should do everything we can to struggle with and root out this passion. And then he's going to go on and say that you have to endeavor with all your strength to be the pattern of a perfect Christian. That's going to be difficult. And if the first endeavors prove weak, don't give up to despair, because that would be cowardice. What you're fighting with is your own desire and your own nature, also habits and things like that as well. So this is going to be a difficult and lifelong struggle. And then he begins talking about temptations. And here Abelard is he's starting to do some teaching, as Heloise has asked him to do, some spiritual direction. And he's going to essentially repeat something that by this time is well established in terms of what we could call the psychology of temptation and giving into it. Everybody's going to be tempted at one time or another. And he says temptations actually have degrees. Now, he doesn't mean by that that they go from one level to the next. That, of course, we know some things are more tempting than others. What he means there is that temptations begin in a certain way and they end in a certain way as well. So he's going to talk about them beginning with mere thoughts. There's some sort of suggestion, this would be a good idea for me to do. I think this would be helpful or pleasant. And then we linger with it and we start to derive a certain pleasure out of them. A delectatio is how it's usually put in medieval Latin. And then he says we pause on it and then we yield to it. And this is what we call assent, giving into it, saying, yes, I will take this on. Now, assent is bad, right? You are deliberately choosing it. The pleasure is not good. The thoughts, they're not good, but you can have as many of them so long as you don't take them in and turn them over in your imagination and then finally give in to them. So, he thinks this is an important teaching that could be quite helpful, particularly with the temptation that they have to think that they could still be lovers. And he goes on and says that Heloise actually has a greater obligation to the virtues than she would if she was just any old nun. Why? Because she's the abbess. She's in charge. She presents an example. He says, you're at the head of a society, and there's a difference between those who lead a private life and those who are charged with the conduct of others. The first only need to labor for their own sanctification and acquitting themselves of those duties. They're not required to practice all the virtues in such a visible or apparent manner, right, where people can witness them. He says, those who have the conduct of others entrusted to them, by their example, they should engage to do all the good they're capable of. So you really need to become a perfect model of the religious recluse. Is that possible for you to do? He says, yes, because God gave us guidance, and I'm going to remind you what that guidance is that can help you out. So he brings up the tables of the law coming from what Christians call the Old Testament, the Hebrew writings, right, the scriptures. So the tables of the law tell people how they ought to behave, the old law. Then he says in the New Testament, he's written that law of grace in our hearts. There's new teachings, right, from this Jesus figure. And then we're given grace to perform God's will. And then he says, if this were not enough, in all dates of the church, he raised up people who by their exemplary life might excite others to their duty. These are what, are often called the saints, the holy people. And they provide models for how to behave. And they could be every age, sex, and condition. And then the fourth thing is the virtues. He says, strive now to unite in yourself all the virtues which have been scattered in these different states. Have the purity of virgins, the austerity of anchorites, the zeal of pastors and bishops, the constancy of martyrs, right? And then you are actually going to make real progress, and you won't have to worry about death. And he talks quite a bit about, how the saints approach death. And then he's going to conclude this by suggesting that what she needs to do is essentially banish Abelard from her heart. He says, if you apply yourself to the business of your salvation, that should be your whole concern. That should be your sole focus. Don't think about me. This is the best advice I can give you. The remembrance of a person we've loved criminally, wrongly, against the law, cannot but be hurtful, whatever advances we've made in virtue. So you can be making advances in virtue, but if you're still thinking about me and the wonderful time we had together, or how sad you are that I'm not here, that is going to hold you back. And he says, when you have torn out your unhappy inclination to me, that is going to make the practice of the virtues so much easier. You're not going to be drawn in two different directions. You're not going to be sort of like lagging behind. And he's going to finish up by saying, farewell, Heloise. This is the last advice of your dear Abelard. This is the last time. Let me persuade you to follow the holy rules of the gospel. Let your heart, once so sensible of my love, now be directed by my zeal. May the idea of your loving Abelard be changed into the image of Abelard truly penitent. And may you shed as many tears for your salvation as you've done during the course of our misfortunes. So this is where we're going to see a resolution to the correspondence between these two great medieval lovers who were indeed married, certainly had dalliances before that, are outstanding intellectual representatives of their time, and are living in this unhappy condition, writing letters back and forth to each other. It seems like they're on the path to leaving that love behind, the carnal love, conjugal love as well, no longer a possibility since he's been castrated, and directing all of their love to God, but doing so in a kind of friendship that's maintained with each other.